Welcome to California Highways Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about the numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by the California Highways webpage and Gribble Nation.
I'm Daniel Fagan. I do the California Highways page at www.cahighways.org.
I'm Tom Fear. I'm one of 4 admins on Gribble Nation. I'm the one usually writing and posting about California or pretty much anything in the Southwest.
This is episode 1.11, Highway Naming. We're coming down to the end of the season, and this season has been like the preparatory phase of the risk management framework. We're establishing the background you really need to understand our future episodes when we're going to go route by route through the highway system. The first 6 episodes we did explored the history of the state highway system. We talked about how we got to the routes we have today. It provided the context for future discussions of legislative routes, state-signed routes, and current routes. It defined the major eras of the state highway system, the initial road construction boom, U.S. highways, the birth of freeways and expressways, the interstate era, and the maintenance and recession era.
Our second group of 4 episodes was focused on highway numbering, but we had a few detours along the way. We learned about how California assigned numbers and their patterns. We learned about the California post-mile system. We learned about the U.S. highway numbers and how they are assigned and managed. We learned about the interstates, how they are numbered, what chargeable versus non-chargeable means, the history of the highway system in California. We learned about the county-signed route system. We also had lots of interesting interviews with folks knowledgeable in these areas.
If you missed any of these episodes, we encourage you to go visit our back catalog. You can find previous episodes at caroutebyroute.org. They're also available on the Spotify for Podcasters, formerly Anchor.fm website that's linked to off of caroutebyroute.org, and you should be able to find them in your favorite podcasting application.
In this episode, we will talk about highway naming, historical names, how expressways and freeways were originally named, the current approach to highway naming, and the changing role in highway naming, and why.
Now, historically, who names things? Who names the streets you have in your community? And the real answer is the developer or the community, and the names come from many sources. There are things that are old standards, numbers, 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, trees, spruce, oak, pine, presidents. We've all seen Washington Boulevard or Lincoln Boulevard or the Roosevelt Highway or states. These are common things, or they're names of people the developer knows, old girlfriends, things like that. They're historical people, often from the area. There's a site I linked to in the April highway headlines that goes into the history of all the street names in Los Angeles, for example. And I have a friend who's written a book, Jim Umbach, that goes into all the history of the street names up in Reno, where he lives. And sometimes they are made-up names that just fit a theme. And it's often haphazard and isn't controlled. And the names often change at regional borders. You leave the city, you go and do somewhere else, and the name changes.
Around here in the Central Valley, the big driver of names was the railroad companies. So you got a lot of standards, like with the Southern Pacific, the ATSF. They all kind of had their little naming conventions that kind of usually are kind of regional to areas that had a lot of rail freight corridors. Interurban highways are often named on the basis of their location and their eventual destinations, such as the Big Oaks Flat Road and the Stockton Highway. Some names were promoted by boosters. This is especially true for auto trails. Some prominent examples would be the Pacific Highway, the Lincoln Highway, and the Three Flags Highway. These names become ingrained in the community and tend to stick around.
Now, for California state highways, the smaller highways often kept the names that were established by local usage. And you can see this in a couple of areas. So, for example, the MacArthur Freeway took over the MacArthur Boulevard, and it just sort of kept that name. Originally, the freeways and expressways were named by the Division of Highways or the California Highway Commission. And the names, as I noted, often reflected the street or highway they replaced, or sometimes where they were going. and various districts had their own policies on this. In Southern California, District 7, District 11, things like that, the streets they replaced, or often what they paralleled, gave the initial start for the names. So things like the Olympic Parkway, the Ramona Parkway, the Sepulveda Freeway, the Arroyo Seco Parkway. Most of those names have gone by the wayside, except for the Arroyo Seco, mainly because those roads have gone by the wayside. More commonly in this early era in Southern California, not Northern California, things were named by their ultimate destination. So you have the Santa Monica Freeway, the San Diego Freeway, the Ventura Freeway, the Hollywood Freeway, the Pasadena Freeway. There were a few exceptions to that, the most notable being something like the Golden State Freeway that went all the way up
the state.
And the name was preferred over the number because the name covered multiple route numbers. And the belief is that this what led to folks in Southern California using the before highway numbers. So the Ventura Freeway covered Route 101 and Route 134. And so when people started calling things by their numbers, it became the 101 and the 134. And this was common with other freeways. The Hollywood would cover both 170 and 101. The San Diego would cover both the 405 and the 5. And the names just continued in use. District 4 did things differently. They tended to name things after people, like the Nimitz, the Younger, the Sarah. Names that were acquired through local usage, long local usage, like the Bayshore. And in some cases, I noted the names of the routes that were replaced.
In this part of the state, they kind of tend to have some wonky sounding names, like early in the Division of Highways era. Like one I remember for Legislative Route 10, which is now Highway 198, was the San Lucas Lateral. Legislative Route 4.
They like to use the name lateral a lot on a lot of them.
I noticed that. It's kind of a not very intuitive name convention, though. The big one in this area was for Legislative Route 4, pretty much like between Sacramento and Wheeler Ridge, or Sacramento and Bakersfield, was the inland route. This was what became US 99, and I almost guarantee you nobody's ever even heard of that before.
That actually became the Golden. They used Golden State, I think, for a lot of it.
They use it on some of the roads, but it was never adopted into the freeway name, because I've actually made that mistake myself, calling Highway 99 in the Central Valley the Golden State Freeway, because I have heard people locally call it that. Like in Fresno County, you had Golden State Boulevard, which carried much of US Route 99, and around Bakersfield, you had Golden State Avenue. So there was some continuation of that from Southern California, but it kind of was hit or miss. Things started to regularize starting in 1962. Senate Concurrent Resolution 8 requested a study and report regarding the naming of freeways, highways, and expressways. This report made recommendations and suggested criteria for naming highways and freeways. In response to the report, the legislature in 1963, SCR 12 placed a moratorium on assigning further highway names. In 1967, subsequent legislation directed the Division of Highways, later Caltrans, to update and expand the report. Caltrans did and recommended the following. Freeway naming should be vested in the singular authority, the Highway Commission, which is now the California Transportation Commission. Naming should be provided on a basis of the motorist's needs. Geographical or historical names are most suitable. Terminal or destination names are not suitable. Memorial names should be avoided. A single name shall apply to the entire length of a route between logical points. Names should be limited to a maximum of 12 letters, not including the word freeway. This recommendation was pretty much universally ignored.
And today we've gotten to the point where highways are named officially, and I put that in quotes, either through general usage, but this rarely makes the signs you see on the road, or by legislative action. And this occurs when a legislator introduces a resolution naming a piece of freeway after someone. And they are really sloppy on doing it. It wasn't until maybe 2 years ago that you started even seeing post miles in the names. So they would name things and the names would overlap. They wouldn't know whether they had named things after someone else. It was really haphazard. Nowadays, they tend to have post miles on them and say we are naming it from post mile X to post mile Y. And the Senate Transportation Committee enforces a general policy on naming. This policy is that any person being recognized must have provided extraordinary public service or contributed to the public good. The signage be installed at no cost to the public. The authors and co-authors of the joint resolution must reside in the area of the structure being dedicated, and the dedication must reflect community consensus and have no local opposition. How will they enforce that? I don't know. There are some names where you wonder why they picked this name, and then some names, they've got good stories, and often it's just, this was a CHP officer or someone who died in the line of duty, or a private who was out in Afghanistan and got killed, and his parents got a naming piece after him. Was their service extraordinary? It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's been one of these things that, like, I think you hit on very well on your page, is like what the current naming conventions, like the memorial highways, are. I'm kind of hit and miss on Gribble Nation, but there is a lot of them out there, just like a ton. And like, I've always wondered, like, how many of these are really necessary.
Now, I will note there is no requirement that the person being honored be deceased, and the sponsors of the dedication must raise funds for at least 2 roadside signs, one in each direction, and these cost typically between $800 to $1,200, depending on the length of names inscribed on them. I'm sure material costs have gone up of late. Now, in 2009, the Assembly and Senate Transportation Commissions codified a policy, and this said that the person being honored, again, should have provided extraordinary public service, as we saw before, that the legislator had to be in the district, that there had to be community consensus, that the proposed naming not replace a prior naming unless there's overwhelming support for the name change. The person being honored must be deceased, except for elected officials, in which case they have to be out of office, and the stretch of highway being named must be longer than 5 miles. There were some additional things, and a revised policy was recommended. So you've got what you had before. They need to have provided extraordinary public service. They need to be deceased. It needs to be no cost to the state. The representative or co-author has to live in the district. It can't be more than 5 miles in length. The designation must reflect community consensus. It must not supersede a designation. And they have to work with legislative affairs to ensure that this segment meets the requirement. You want to know the reality, Tom?
Most of these memorial designations are ignored and not used in common practice. One of the major exceptions to this would be Google Maps. So you'll typically see these appear on Google Earth when you're kind of scanning over highways. They appear in the name. Caltrans is generally de-emphasizing route names. New signage generally use the shield and the number, not the name. The rationale, GPS mapping applications and driving directions use the number, not the name. Most people have no idea the significance of the name. That's kind of what I was hitting at earlier on. Like, most of these names, unless you have some sort of inside knowledge, you're really not even going to know who they're even referencing.
And the names also have problems. There's what I like to call the naming hall of shame. These are highways named after people who, in retrospect, we would go, why? Certainly, we all are aware of the problems with the Richard M. Nixon Freeway. And I don't even think that name, it certainly doesn't appear on the western part of Route 90 anymore. I may still appear out in Whittier. But there are other ones that are a little bit less clear. There's the Richard T. Silverman Bridge on I-15. And after it was named, he was busted in an FBI sting for laundering $300,000 in what he believed was Colombian drug money. There's also the Oscar Rios Highway, Route 129, and he had allegations of sexual impropriety. And then there are names that, in the light of history, we're rethinking. One of the most famous and notorious examples, and you'll see this mentioned, I think, on every road geeking group, is the Christopher Columbus Transcontinental Highway, which originally had signs both on I-10 in Santa Monica and at the other end of I-40 in North Carolina. And I can't speak for North Carolina, but in California, there was lots of controversy. And recently, like in the last year, the legislature passed a resolution that removed the Christopher Columbus name. I think the sign had been stolen a long time ago. There are similar complaints about Father Sarah and the Junipero Serra route, which is 280. because of how he treated the indigenous folks in the area, and there are movements to remove that name. I've even seen, just in the last couple of weeks, some folks who want to rename the city of Berkeley because of problems. And you have similar associations with the El Camino Real. Are you aware of any others, Tom, where the names nowadays are just, what were they thinking?
I mean, there's lots of them. Like the big one that I run into probably most frequently because I admin a US 101 Facebook page is El Camino Real. And there tends to be some pretty furious back and forth on that one in particular. A lot of people kind of are looking at how the Spanish treated the Native Americans and referencing like Spanish El Camino Real, whereas the people that kind of want to keep the name are kind of referencing it more so now is just an early auto trail name that was kind of prominent in the Spanish revival period of the 20th century. So it's interesting when highway names come up like this because there tends to be a lot of back and forth and not a lot of satisfactory answers for everyone involved.
And I'll note you've got a similar thing with the named auto trails. There was both in competition to the Lincoln Highway, right? There was the Jefferson Davis Trail and the Dixie Highway, which are now problematic names.
Yep. And that's one when I lived in Florida that was becoming kind of a big thing in the news, especially in southern Florida, was the Dixie Highway. And down there, a lot of the local streets, which were named Dixie Highway, have been since renamed.
Yeah, I believe it went into San Diego, if I recall correctly. And there have been some issues down in San Diego with this. Now, Tom highlighted the fact that for a lot of the new names, most people have no idea who these folks are. So now we're going to talk about what Tom and I do to combat this. I do the California Highways webpage, and we have an entire page where we list every possible known name of a highway in California. I don't do it down to the street level, but certainly all the naming resolutions, all the names the Division of Highways published, all the names that were proposed for routes. And I try and present the relevant details so you know who this person is. And if I can find a picture of the person, I'll put it there. If I can find a picture of the naming sign to show actually what the name is in the field, I'll put it there. And I try and put in a lot of the details from the naming resolution, except for those details that I feel could be used for identity theft. I will not put in, for example, specific birthdays, or I will not put in the details of who their spouse was and who their kids were, just because, yeah, it was important to them and it's important to the family, but I don't think it's that important historically. We don't need to say, Joe was a great person and was loved by the community. You wouldn't get a naming sign if that wasn't the case. When we do the California route by route pages, we are going to pick for each of the routes some of the more significant names and give you the details. So if you listen to our sample episode on Route 105, for example, we talk about Sadio E. Munimori, who is the fellow that the 105-405 interchange is named after, and he was someone who gave up his life to protect his platoon in World War II by jumping on a grenade. That's something you don't get from the sign. You'll get that out on my website. So just go to my website, go to the naming section for any highway, and you can see who these folks are. Now, Tom, over on Gribble Nation, also does a lot with names. And I'll let Tom talk about how he approaches names in the Gribble Nation blog.
So I tend to focus on a lot of the early naming conventions that kind of have gotten lost historically. And this would kind of mainly date back to auto trails and how early legislative routes were named. I kind of referenced one with the San Lucas Lateral and Legislative Route 10 earlier in the podcast. But there's a lot of maps just out there, commercial division of highways, California Highway Commission, and a lot of them often display names of the highways related specifically to auto trails. So when I do a blog now, I try to capture all the known auto trail names that went along with that highway. And there's some overlap sometimes with division of highways names, like the Redwood Highway is a real prominent example of this, where, yeah, that was named by the California Highway Commission, but that more or less functioned as an auto trail. And then you kind of capture some of the major ones everyone knows about, like the Lincoln Highway, some ones that kind of were early that kind of got got incorporated by the state, like El Camino Real. And this all kind of tends to lead.
Have you ever talked about the history of the Roosevelt Highway name? That used to be, I know, in Southern California, the Old Coast Highway.
I
And
have a little bit.
I think it was after Theodore Roosevelt, wasn't it?
Yeah, yes, it was. That was of the era when he was getting names for a lot of things. So that's kind of an interesting one. This is what people know now as PCH, or Pacific Coast Highway on Route 1. Yeah, that was all Roosevelt Highway, and a lot of 1 just in general was originally Roosevelt Highway in general, like even through Big Sur.
It might be an interesting blog for you to do one of these days on the Roosevelt Highway name, because I know the name's fallen by the wayside. I remember when they built the camp I went to as a kid, which is right a mile north of the Ventura County line, LA Ventura County at Yerba Buena. They initially said it was on the Roosevelt Highway, and this was 1952 when it opened. And now, if you were to ask people where the Roosevelt Highway was, they'd have no idea.
Yeah, and it even add to that, in unrelated to the Roosevelt Highway we're talking about, there's a lot of auto trails that incorporated Roosevelt in their name. And like the Midland Roosevelt was like the really big one that was like all over and had like multiple directional routes within California. So I think that's kind of why that kind of fell by the wayside a little bit, because there's just so many things that had Roosevelt in the name, especially when you get towards World War II and you're reference, which Roosevelt are you referencing? So I think that's kind of what was the main driver to paring that down.
One thing we don't have in the highway community, we're talking names here, and this is a shorter episode, is really good pages that explore the auto trails that were in California and across the country. James Schul many years ago had a couple of pages on them, and I think those have died. And that could be something you could have fun with, is just what was the Pacific Highway in California? What was the Three Flags Highway? What was the Park to Park Highway? These names were significant, just as important as the numbers we have today. Those names had reverence for the drivers in the early days of the Good Roads movement. We're talking 1915 to maybe 1930, I would think.
Yeah, and some of them have just as big a following as U.S. routes, like the Lincoln Highway Association. That is arguably just as big as any U.S. route following.
Now, the other thing Tom goes into on the Gribble Nation blog that I certainly don't cover is the history of the names of the communities for some of these roads. I recall seeing that in some of what you've written on the US 101 blogs and on the US 99 blogs, where you'll talk about where did this community get its name?
Yep. And a lot of that with the big ones like 101 and 99, I mentioned it a little bit earlier in this podcast, is railroads. Like the Southern Pacific, especially, and to a lesser degree, the ATSF, they named like so many of the towns that are around today. You can even look up a random image of Google Maps along a railroad corridor. It doesn't even necessarily need to be on a state highway, and you'll see like random names there, because that's from the railroad companies naming sidings that became towns or sometimes died out and just became ghost town sites.
I'm familiar with that from the Railroad Museum, which is located in Paris, which was named after the station master of that community down in Riverside County.
Then one that I think I'm getting better at on my pages, mainly the newer blogs, is actually just capturing images of the memorial highway names. That was something I think I really undervalued in the past, but then I saw how you did it on your site and thought it was something that, in retrospect, I probably should have focused on a lot more. So we're getting better at it on Gribble Nation. Sometimes I end up missing the signs, though.
Well, I'd like to find pictures of are the ones where I haven't been able to find the name. Maybe it's not been out in the field yet, or the name just never made it to a sign. We see that in a lot of roads where they never put the full name on the sign. A good example of that is Interstate 605, which you will rarely see fully labeled as the San Gabriel River Freeway. Name. Okay.
Yeah, and when I did the blog on that, that was like the one thing everybody kept pointing out, because I titled it Interstate 605, the San Gabriel River Freeway. And everybody and their brother was pretty much saying they either didn't know it had a name, or that's why they referred to it as the 605, because it's just a mouthful to say.
That's probably why they don't put the name on the sign. They're paying by the letter. Same thing with the Los Angeles River Freeway, which became the Long Beach Freeway. Shorter name. So if you want to find the names, look to our blogs. Look to California Highways, look to Gribble Nation. You'll learn the history of the names, which I think is important. Now, why do we care about names? Well, names are more than numbers, more than just point A to point B. They give the highway a character, they give the highway the history, they give the highway a story, I think. They're critical to communities they serve. They highlight the people and organizations that are important to the communities, and they make it more than just a dot that this number passes through. And for many people, I think travel is more than the journey. It's knowing the history of the places and the people we pass through on the way. Or, as I like to say, Roman Mars, who does the 99% Invisible podcast, which if you haven't listened to, you should, says always stop and read the plaque. Too many people just drive by and they don't know the history of these things. And there are just untold stories in the plaques. Now, you have to be careful. Was it Eclampus Vitus group that goes around putting up fake plaques?
Non-official ones. So you got the ones which are actual California historic markers. Then you have Eclampus Vitus, which goes around just putting up wherever they feel is important. And sometimes I found some contradictions with the information more so than I have with the official ones.
I know they've got a plaque up somewhere on the edge of Route 80, I think, where they actually officially recognize it as the Emperor Norton Highway. I think I have a picture of that on my Route 80 page. But that's a good example of that. And I know there are all sorts of plaques up in Gold Country.
Yeah, that's where they're mainly focused around is the Sierra foothills. And they got quite a few in the Central Valley, too. They seem to really, really like this area.
But yeah, it's used. I've done some walking tours of cities, and you will often find these sort of plaques around. And it's worth just taking a second and stopping and reading. If you're not familiar with 99% Invisible, it is a podcast that explores hidden design in things. I mean, they did a whole episode on the carpet in the Portland airport and how it was used for wayfinding, to give you an idea. By the way, I haven't listened to it yet, but I will mention it. There is a new podcast out there on the history of San Diego freeways. It is called Freeway Exit. And there are 4 episodes out there right now that talk about San Diego's first freeway, a feat of social engineering, freeway revolts, and the issue of reparation. It is a documentary podcast being done by KPBS in San Diego.
I'll have to check that out. I actually did a episode with Roadway Wiz that probably covered much of what they talked about. I'd be interested to hear their take.
Yeah, that looks like it should be interesting. I don't know as much about the San Diego freeways, so I'm looking forward to listening to this, especially things like the freeway revolts in San Diego. I know about them in LA, I know about them in the Bay Area, but I don't know about San Diego. So that should be interesting. As for us, next time, we have one more episode to go, and season 1 will be complete.
Our last episode, we will explore those agencies we've been talking about pretty much throughout this entire season. Caltrans, the California Transportation Commission, the Regional Transportation Planning Agencies in AASHTO. We'll look into their history and their role as they kind of relate to California highways today.
And it's interesting, you know, everyone talks about Caltrans, but it's really much more that Caltrans does the planning and the Transportation Commission authorizes the spending. And it's an interesting separation of powers that I think most people just don't understand.
Yeah, I love to point that out on Facebook groups is when people are upset at the Caltrans district. It's like your ire is misdirected.
Well, I think a lot of people don't understand things. The Route 118 off-ramp at Reseda just opened last week, okay? They finally reopened it. They're not quite done with it. And everyone is complaining about it, of course, and none of them understood the whole funding sequence and the whole repair sequence that was involved in just fixing a failed culvert. And then you look at larger things like, how long it takes to get a road simply resurfaced. And they just don't understand the whole process.
Nope.
You know, they think, it's like I can walk out and hire a contractor and get it done immediately. And no, that's not how it works in this state. You have to go and plan it out. You have to go do environmental reviews. You then have to do series of public hearings. You then have to build it into a transportation plan, which gets noticed and then has to get noticed again before you can spend the money. And there are all these different phases. And it takes multiple years just to do a simple repair sometimes.
Yeah, that's not even getting into things like the role the legislature plays, like in route numbering. It's just, it's by committee. Like, I don't know how else really to describe it. It's by committee, and when you have a committee, there's multiple steps involved.
There's something I recall. There's a bill that I haven't looked at right now that's out there that wants to dictate where highways go without dictating where highways go because the state legislature can't say you will build this. And I forget exactly where the route is, but it's something I have saved for. It was in last month's highway headlines. But we'll be looking at all these organizations in the next episode.
For more information, visit the highway numbering section on cahighways.org. For Gribble Nation, the one I'm really going to recommend related to this episode in names is the blog When Did People Begin to Refer to the Ridge Route as the Grapevine? This kind of plays hand in hand with this episode in highway naming, because that's a big one right there. A number of specific links will be shown on our page. Links to relevant information on the show page, caroutebyroute.org. Details for specific routes on specific route pages on cahighways.org and gribblenation.org.
And I'm going to encourage you again to conceivably think about doing some of these on named highways for some of your blogs. You could have fun with that.
Yeah, well, I'm getting through the sign route, so that's probably where we're going next.
As always, information on the episode is available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can leave us comments on the episode. The episode is also available on our Spotify for Podcasters Home, formerly Anchor.fm, which you can still get to at anchor.fm/caroutebyroute. And join us for at least one more episode in Season 1 as we continue to explore California highways route by route. We'll then have a short hiatus, and then I write Season 2, and then we'll go into Season 2 and start actually going route by route through the state highways. This episode was written by Daniel Fagan and Tom Fear, edited and produced by Daniel Fagan. Our opening theme is I Like to Be by the Seaside by John H. Glover Kind. If you have an opening theme you think would be good to use for our show and is either in the public domain or you're willing to let us use, let me know. Episodes are recorded using freeconferencecall.com. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribble Nation at gribblenation.org. And with that, I like to close with what I always close with. Sort of think of it like your end credit sequence at the end. Tom, do you have any final thoughts on highway names in California?
I really think this is a topic that I think people probably could really dig into, like in the road community in general. I think there's an overemphasis and focus on like highway signs and font types and everything. And this is kind of like territory that kind of lends more towards history that I think as a community we probably can do a better job at researching and looking into. And I think there's a lot to see, like finding out who the people are these highways are named after, finding out why highways are named a specific way. There's a lot of virgin territory out there regarding this, and it really doesn't just apply to California. You could probably do any state and find a similar thing.
Yeah, I've never looked into how the highways are named in other states at all. I've never really thought about it.
I've done quite a bit with Arizona, and in Arizona, like that's pretty much like a forgotten topic. Like in general, I did a blog on Arizona State Route 74 in the original iteration of that highway, which is largely US 60 now. West of Wickenburg was called the Sun-Kissed Highway. I think I've only ever encountered maybe 2 people in the last 20 years that even knew that was a name.
And I guess since you mentioned that, we should talk about one other aspect of naming that wasn't covered in the podcast, but is important to people, which is the names given to structures by traffic reporters. This, of course, has been a big deal in California with things like the Orange Crush or the 4-level. You have it in San Diego with the Spaghetti Bowl, I think it is. And then you have folks who seem to remember names. There's one fellow over on one of the Facebook groups, Freeways of LA, who seems to always say, I think it's the 170 101 junction has a particular name, and I go, I've never heard of it referred to by that name, but he's insistent that it was called that. And I'm sure there are similar names in use in the Bay Area.
Like the Cypress Viaduct, that's always been the big one up there. But that probably got famous because of Loma Prieta earthquake.
I think more there's a big, was it the MacArthur Maze is up there? Yes. And there's and that one refers, I think, to the whole junction of 80 and 580 and what used to be 17, it's now 880. Is that the MacArthur Maze? Or does that one have a different name?
I think that's all 580. Because you got the Nimitz Freeway, which is 880 and Old 17. I think the MacArthur Maze, and this is going to probably surprise people that don't know this off the top of my head. I believe that refers to the section east of downtown Oakland. That kind of just like wiggles all around the city and has like a truck prohibition on it.
Yeah, that's straight 580. But these names are given by traffic reporters, and it's now something maybe it's less prevalent than it's used to. So I'll preface this with, kids, in the old days, we used to listen to AM radio, and you had traffic reporters on the AM radio, and they would call these things out and refer to them by the name. Nowadays, is witnessed by the fact that car manufacturers want to remove AM radios. I think people get their traffic reports by looking at Google Maps, and you don't hear these names anymore. But these junctions, these structures, had names, especially if they had a lot of traffic in them.
Yeah, there's one for the junction of, and the name eludes me off the top of my head, but I do hear in traffic reports for Fresno for the junction of 41, 180, and 168.
Oh, that's a horrible junction because two of them run parallel, as I recall.
Yeah, it's 168 basically kind of sort of ends at 180, but it continues to 41 also. Then you have some strangely placed exits like McKinley, which are like within half a mile of the interchange, and it's the worst bottleneck in Fresno by far, which is why I think it kind of tends to get some notoriety. But like even Phoenix, like you had the stack and the mini stack. Those were the two that always got mentioned.
And I think this shows the importance of names to people, and especially the names of freeways that you learned when you were a kid and learning to drive. Right? Those names stick with you.
Yeah, like the Lodge in Detroit. For me, that was the one I was growing up with.
Well, I grew up down by Westchester, so I was mostly dealing with the San Diego Freeway and the names there. But I remember driving the 90 right after it was named the Nixon Freeway and seeing those signs. I think that was one of the memories I have of driving with my brother back then. So that's it for highway naming. Hopefully you found this interesting. And we will see you next time when we talk about the organizations of California highways.